Welcome back to another episode of Word Safari. This is the third in a four-part series on what I call little words with big impact. These little words are prepositions and preverbs that come from the Greek and Latin languages. Now, every language has prepositions. English has many, of course. Here are some examples like over the moon, with your friends. But oftentimes you can put these words onto the beginning of verbs as well, and often they act in the same way or similar ways when you do so. Now, we borrowed a lot of words, specifically verbs, with some of these preverbs attached onto them already in Greek or Latin, and so it really pays dividends to learn some of these little words that are in Greek and Latin. So we're going to go through another set of them here in this safari. Let's talk about the semantic sphere of with. For the past couple of episodes, we've been going semantic sphere by semantic sphere. So let's talk about prepositions that I consider to be in the semantic sphere of with. Obviously, the word with, the word beside, if something's beside you, it's kind of with you. Through, if you go through something, then you're in its general vicinity, and across kind of goes along with that as well. So let's look at some Latin and Greek prepositions or preverbs that belong within this semantic sphere. Now, one of the big ones, and honestly, this totally deserves its own safari, or maybe a couple of safaris, so that might be coming down the line. But for now, let's just introduce it. This is the word that is very important, and we get all sorts of prepositions and preverbs, and specifically words on the start of verbs in English from this Latin word in it. This is the Latin word cone. Comb in Latin is sometimes spelled cum when it's by itself as a preposition, but when you attach it onto something, it's usually spelled cone, or if there's assimilation going on, comb. Sometimes that N will assimilate in other ways too, as we will see. Now, cone, comb, cum, this word in Latin means with, or together, or completely, and so oftentimes when you put it onto a word, it means to do something completely, not just to do something with something, and sometimes in English we express that sentiment in different ways. So instead of using the word with, like Latin does to express the sentiment of completely, sometimes we use the preposition up, which if you think about it, doesn't necessarily make sense. What does up have to do with, being complete in any way? Nonetheless, we do use it in that sense often. And so sometimes I'm going to translate these sentiments as up instead of with, even though the Latin word is with. So this is a great example here on your screen. The word conclude comes from two Latin words that mean to close up, to close completely, to close with, to close together. You can kind of see why the Romans would use the preposition with to express that idea of completeness. So clude comes from a Latin word that means close, to close something, and then they put cone on the front of it, which means to close together, and we would probably translate that into English as to close up. Other words in English that we have this cone on the front of, honestly, again, there are a lot of them, and this could be a whole safari, so consider this a little bit of an appetizer. Let's put it that way. Conduct means to lead together. The Duke root means to lead, and so conduct means to lead together. A conference, that's a bringing together, which makes sense because that's what a conference is people are brought together for a certain purpose. To congregate, this is interesting because the Greg root in Latin means flock. In fact, the name Greg or Gregory actually comes from this Latin root as well. So to congregate means to flock together. That's all that means. To connect, those two N's are important because that's actually where you split the two morphemes or meaning-bearing units. The first N goes with the cone and the second N goes with this other root nect. In Latin, it means to tie or to bind or to unite in some way. So to connect means to tie together. That kind of makes sense, right? That's all that word actually means when you break it up. To conserve means to save up, because the serve root in Latin actually means to save. To contain means to hold together. If something contains something, then it holds it together within itself, and that's essentially what that means. This one's interesting. Combine. Notice that in this case, the N has assimilated to the B and become an M, because M is a sound you make with your lips, and B is a sound you make with your lips, and N is not a sound that you make with your lips. So the M is closer to the B, and it's easier to say combine than combine. In fact, if you're not paying attention, combine will naturally become combine. combine. So it's spelled with an M because you say it with an M due to assimilation. Combine just means to put two things together. You can actually see the by there, to, by, there at the end of the word in combine. So that's all combine means, to put two things together. And now another instance where there's more assimilation, but in this case the N has completely assimilated to the following consonant. That is collaborate. This used to be cone-laborate. You can see the labor in laborate, which means to work, as you would probably guess. So if you're collaborating with someone, you are working together with them. That is essentially what that word means. And again, once you break it down, you can see those Latin morphemes, those little meaning-bearing units of language, and they make sense, and English makes more sense too, which is presumably why you're watching this. I'm sure there's a lot of Latin fans out there, but there's even more English fans, or at least English speakers out there. The word in Greek that basically meant the same thing as cone or comb or cum in Latin was sin, and also we get some assimilation there, so the N at the end of sin may also assimilate to the following consonant as well. Let's see some words where we get this particular Greek word, synchronous, synchronicity. These are words that have something to do with being at the same time. You can see the chron, like chronology or chronometer. All these words have something to do with time because they come from the Greek word for time. So synchronous just means at the same time. Here's an interesting one. Symptom. Notice that the N has assimilated to the following P, which is a sound you make with your lips, so it has become sim instead of sin. So symptom literally means a falling together. What does that mean? The original idea is that there were multiple symptoms that would fall together, or indications of a sickness that would show that you are sick with something. That is essentially a symptom. And actually going along with that, kind of one step up, is a syndrome, which in Greek means a running together. This is a running together of various symptoms to show that you have a particular syndrome. A syndrome is a running together of symptoms, and symptoms are a falling together of different things that happen to you to show that you may have a particular sickness. So it's interesting that both of these words that have to do with health and sickness both contain this Greek word. Another word that you probably are familiar with that contains this Greek word is synonym. The onym part in Greek means a name, but that's also the word that they use for noun. Actually, noun comes from the Latin word for name through French, because a noun is just a name. It's a name for something. That's where we get the word noun from. So a synonym is not just the same name, but it's the same noun. It's a similar name for something, and that's essentially what the word synonym means. What about a synthesis? The the part, the thesis part, means a setting out or a placing of some kind. So a synthesis just means a placing of multiple things together. You're synthesizing something, you're bringing them together. And then this one's actually pretty interesting because the N doesn't just assimilate, it goes away before the S. They just dropped it completely. So a system is a standing together. It's when a bunch of things stand together and act as one. That's a system, right? Kind of makes sense when you see it. Finally, let's see a word where we do have assimilation of the N to an L, kind of like we saw in Latin with collaborate. That's the word syllable. This used to be syllable, and then the N assimilated to the following L. The lab root in Greek means to take, so a syllable is a taking together. You are taking multiple sounds together at the same time. That's all a syllable is. Kind of makes sense, right? Pretty cool when you see it. Let's go to another Greek word that is kind of in this general semantic sphere, and that is para. In English, we would say para, but in Greek, this preposition para or para meant beside, alongside, outside of, next to, something like that. And so we use it in some of those ways. Paragraph is pretty interesting. Paragraph literally just means something written alongside, which is not really how we use this word today. A paragraph is, of course, a unit of text or something, usually 4 or 5 sentences, and then we, hit enter and indent and start a new paragraph. But where does paragraph get its name? Well, originally, you wouldn't indent and, hit enter and all these other things because they didn't have, computers or typewriters. So how did they show when they wanted to sort of start a new thought the way that we do with enter, indent? Well, they would just draw like a line or something that was outside of the writing, and that's where the word paragraph means. It's something written alongside the writing that shows you that this is a new thought, and that's actually where that word comes from. Parallel in Greek just means beside each other. If two things are parallel, they are beside each other, and that's actually all that word means. If you're a paralegal, some of you might work as a paralegal. You work beside someone who's in the legal profession. I mean, you're in the legal profession, but you work beside an attorney, right? A lawyer, and that's what a paralegal does. Paralyze is interesting because the lies part means to undo or to untie or to destroy if you're undoing the capabilities of something. And I think that's the idea that is here in the word paralyze. You are undoing the capabilities of your body outside of the norm. And that seems to be the idea of the outside in paralyze. Paranoid kind of makes sense. The noid part comes from the Greek word that means mind or your way of thinking. So if you are paranoid, literally, you are next to your mind, you're out of your mind. That's literally what paranoid means. Although we kind of use it in some different ways today. We have different words for out of your mind, but paranoid, that is actually the etymology of the word. What about paraphrase? If you paraphrase something, this literally means to say alongside or to say next to or to say outside of, because you're saying the same thing, but you're putting it in a different way. You are paraphrasing it, and that's what that means. Finally, parasite means something that is feeding alongside. Now, the Latin root that we get words like site, S-I-T-E from, if it wasn't parasite, but just site, is not actually connected to the Greek root that we are talking about here, because the Latin word has to do with the placement of something, the site of something. The Greek root actually means to feed. The Greek root that looks like site means to feed. So a parasite is something that feeds alongside or off of something else. And that's essentially what a parasite does, and that's where it gets its name from. The Latin word per means through or by or completely. So if you are perceptive, the sept part comes from a Latin root that means to take or to take in or something like that. So if you are perceptive, you are taking something in through everything totally into your mind. So you're doing it completely. So this is another word, just like with cone, that Latin can use to denote completeness in some way. If something is perennial, let's say it's a tree or a bush, or just your love for something is perennial. What does that mean? It lasts throughout the year or throughout the years. The per part is the through or throughout part, and the n part comes from the on root, like anniversary and annual, that is in Latin, that word annus that just means year in Latin. Perfect, we use this word all the time, but it comes from Latin. This word just means done completely. It's done all the way through, and that's the through idea there in per. It's totally done, and therefore it's perfect, it's complete, it's not messed up in any way. Obviously, we use this a little bit differently today than the original meaning, but that is the etymology. Sticking with this idea, permanent, the mon root in Latin, means to remain. Actually, we get the main part of remain from that particular Latin root. So if something is permanent, it is remaining through all time. It doesn't change. It's not temporary. Permit means to send through. We've seen the mit root before on this channel. A perspective is a view through to something. If you have a perspective, it's like a window on something, so you have a view through to it. Maybe somebody else has a different perspective. It's like they're looking through a different window, and so you each have a different perspective because you're each looking at something from a different direction. You're viewing it through a different lens, and that's all a perspective is, essentially. If you persecute, hopefully you're not persecuting anybody, but if you are, this comes from these two Latin words, per plus sequa. The sequa root means to follow. So if you persecute, you are following someone very thoroughly with hostile intentions. That is actually the etymology of that particular word. And then our last per word, to show you how per can sometimes be negative, like we just saw with the word persecute, is pervert or perverted. The vert root in Latin means to turn. So if something or someone is perverted, they are turned through. And the idea is like you're turned through in an unnatural way. Like, I don't know, if you turned your arm through your body or this way, literally, etymologically, your arm would be perverted. It would be doing the wrong thing. It would be doing something unusual, unnatural, and probably not good for your arm in general. So that's the etymological meaning of perverted. Again, pretty interesting when you see it. A Greek word that means something similar to the Latin word pair is the Greek word dia. This means through or across, and it can also mean completely at times as well, and some other things. It's a pretty complex word in Greek, but these are the meanings that we usually assign to it in English that we have gotten from Greek. If you diagnose something, or if your doctor diagnoses something, the gno root, which we have looked at before on this channel, means to know. So if you diagnose, you're knowing something through and through, all the way through. You are figuring out what is going on with that particular thing. A diagram means to write through and through, so to write completely, to write up. There's the use in English of that preposition up to show completeness of some kind. You're writing something up, you're diagramming it. Those are synonyms, right? And there's that synonym word again as well. This one's interesting. Where do we get the word diagonal? If something is diagonal, this was originally a math term referring to, let's say you had a square or a cube or something and you had a diagonal. It would go through the angles of the particular square, and so it was diagonal within that particular square, and that's actually where diagonal got its name from. The dia part means through, and the gon part means angle. A dialogue, this kind of makes sense. If you are dialoguing with somebody, what are you doing? You're talking through things. You're not just talking at somebody, but you talk and then they talk, and you are perhaps trying to come to some kind of mutual agreement or resolution or something. That is what a dialogue is. You're talking through it, and that kind of makes sense because it has dia there at the beginning. The diameter, another math term. We get a lot of our math and science terminology, as you probably noticed, from Greek. So diameter means to measure through something. The diameter of something is when you measure through it, especially a circle. This one's very interesting. Diabolical means fitting of the diabolos. Now you might be like, wait, who is the diabolos? Well, in French, diabolos got messed up or run together to devil. The B became a V. They chopped off the ending, so diabolos became devil. That will help you understand who the diabolos is. So if something is diabolical, it's fitting of what the devil would do. That's essentially what that word means. Now, the diabolos is just a Greek name, not a proper name, but like a epithet. We had that word in the last safari. An epithet is like an adjective that describes somebody. So diabolos is an epithet that describes what the devil is supposed to be doing. Dia means through or across. The bol root means to throw. So what does the devil do? He casts aspersions across you or onto you or something like that. That is his original epithet. And if you're wondering why or how he got that epithet, I think this is going to be another safari in the future where some of these biblical terms and religious terms got their names from, because it's not always immediately obvious, and there's often a good story behind it, as you can imagine for this one. A similar word in Latin is trans. We would say trans today, but in Latin it was trans. This means across or beyond. If you transcend something, you are climbing across some kind of barrier. That's what that means. If you transfer something, you're carrying something across from one place to another. If you transform something, you're changing the form across some, metaphorical line of some kind from this to that. That's what it means to transform something. If you are involved in a transgression, this means that you are going across some kind of line that you are not supposed to cross. You broke a law, you committed a sin, or something like that. That's what a transgression is. You crossed a line and you weren't supposed to. Transit and transition both comes from this same Latin root, trans plus it. It means to go, so transit means to go across. The transit system will help you go across from one part of town to another, and if you are part of a transition in your life, you are more metaphorically moving across from one part of your life to another. Translate also means to carry across, just like transfer, because late is actually part of the same root word in Latin as fur, although they don't look anything alike. So to translate means to carry ideas across from one language to another. That's what translation is. And then transmit means to send across. You're sending ideas across from one place to another. Of course, you can also transmit diseases. You can send them across from your body to somebody else's. And then transport just means to carry across. This is a totally different root word in Latin. Port and fare are two different ways in Latin you can say to carry. And so transfer and transport kind of mean the same thing, but they come from two different Latin roots, but they have that same trons there at the beginning. Let's talk about another semantic sphere. So we've been talking about words that I have considered to be in the semantic sphere of with. What about words that are in the semantic sphere of after? Okay, beyond, behind, and of course after. So these are going to be the words that we look at in English that are all kind of, they all kind of have something to do with being after. Maybe in time, maybe in space, all right? So we're going to look at a few words from Greek and Latin that have something to do with being after or, behind or beyond or something like that. The first one we're going to look at here is the Greek word meta or meta that means after or beyond. So it has something to do with changing across or beyond a line or over a line. So you can see that I chose these two semantic spheres on purpose to put in the same Safari because they actually are both pretty related. With and after have a lot of connections to each other. So your metabolism, this is interesting. What does your metabolism do? It literally throws things across. This is the same bowl as in devil, the diabolos. He throws aspersions or accusations across at you. Your metabolism takes things, sugar or whatever you put in your body and changes it into energy. That's why it's called your metabolism. It's throwing it across from sugar into energy. So it's doing some kind of changing. A metamorphosis, I actually just used the Latin translation of this. You can translate meta with trans, you can translate morph with form. So a metamorphosis is actually just a transformation. It's a changing across a line or a boundary into something else. That's all a metamorphosis is. A metaphor has the same fair root as transfer, and we've talked about this in a previous Safari. A metaphor is just carrying an idea across. You're saying that this thing is like this thing. There's a line that separates them, but you're carrying those ideas across a line. If something is metaphysical, then it is beyond what is physical, so that kind of makes sense. If you have something like cancer that metastasizes, the sta root means to stand, and we've talked about that in the previous Safari as well. So metastasize means to stand across, which means to change, or which means to spread across some particular line, which is actually what it means when cancer metastasizes. And then we have method, so the Greek preposition meta would lose the A sometimes. And then if it was before a word that started with an H, it would be spelled TH with a theta in Greek instead of just tau with a T. So method is actually what's left of meta. It's a meta hodos. The hod root means a way or a road or a path. And so a method is a way across. It's a way through. It's a way beyond something to some particular goal. The method is your plan of attack. It's how you are going to get there from point A to point B. Also, by the way, I probably don't need to tell you that we have totally just taken this word over into English, and sometimes you might say something is meta, and that means that it's beyond your expectations or beyond what is normal or something like that. So we have definitely just adopted this word for ourselves in English. A kind of similar word in Latin is ultra. Obviously, we would just say ultra. This is beyond or on the other side of, so we use this in superlatives a lot. If something is ultra whatever, then it means it's beyond anything that is normal, right? If something is ultrasonic, it's beyond audible sound. Kind of going along with that, if you have an ultrasound, an ultrasound is a tool that uses ultrasonic waves to diagnose things in your body and see into your body in a non-invasive manner. And then, of course, we have ultraviolet. These are light waves that are beyond ultraviolet on the spectrum, on the color spectrum of visible light, right? So it's beyond what is visible. That's what it means for something to be ultraviolet. And then finally, let's talk about a very important word. This is the Latin word post, which means after or behind. Now, I want to make clear that in Latin, there are two different posts. There is this one, and that's the one we're talking about today. And then there's another one that means something that is placed. So like a post in the ground comes from the other Latin word because a post in the ground is something that is placed in the ground. It has nothing to do with after or behind. So I just wanted to make clear that there are two different things that look almost the same that come from Latin that mean very different things. So we're talking about the preposition and the preverb post that means after or behind that you can stick on things like posthumous. If something is posthumous, the hum part means the earth or burial in the earth. So if something is posthumous, it is done after somebody's dead and has been buried. That's actually what that hum part means. Interestingly, obviously, you probably know that if something is postmodern, it belongs to the era after what we call the modern era, which just happens to no longer be modern because we have lived past it. But that is where the word postmodern comes from. If you do a postmortem, this literally just means after death in Latin. The mortem part is the word for death in Latin, but we can also use this metaphorically today in English, like you're going to do a postmortem on a game that you played to, break down what you could do better or something like that. If you postpone, you are literally placing it after some other things. You're going to push it down the road and place it later. That's what it means to postpone something. And then if you are writing a letter and you write PS at the end of that letter, you probably know that PS stands for postscript, which just means something that is written after. Obviously, script means written, post means after, and that's all PS means. All right, we've looked at a bunch of words, a bunch of preverbs here that we have borrowed from Latin and Greek into English. We have one more set to look at, and that is going to be in part 4, so stay tuned for that. See you then.